Hello, Andrew. Thanks for being here. This is the podcast of PsychoSocial, my little well-being and training and consulting company. And we have been in a long collaboration with you so far, even before the pandemic. And now I'm happy to have you here, the first guest of our podcast, my podcast. And I'm so happy that this is you to come here first. So let me introduce you very briefly. Andrew Soren is a positive psychology expert. So he has a background in positive psychology. He has been working with companies for a very long time and utilizing the tools of the science of positive psychology for human betterment in workplace. And he's a very amazing friend of mine. Which is an insider information, and I want you to introduce yourself. Actually, who is Andrew? What does Andrew do? And how have you been doing so far?
Right.
Even before pandemic and after pandemic.
Well, thank you, Oski. It's such an honor to be your first guest on this podcast. I'm so excited to be here today, and I'm also so excited to have been a collaborator with you already over the past year, and to get a chance to talk today about some of the important things that are going on in the world and the ways that positive psychology and the work that we both do are able to have an impact right now. So thank you so much for having me on this podcast.
Thank you for being here. Sure. So tell us, who is Andrew?
Sure. So Andrew Soren. Where do I start? That's my name. No, I am, as Oski said, somebody who focuses very much on the application of positive psychology in the workplace. So most of my I have a very strange career path that led me to where I am here today. It's a little bit of theater and some marketing, and then a whole bunch of HR and coaching, organizational design and development. But ultimately, a big reason why I'm here today is because about 8 years ago, 8 years ago, I participated in a Master's of Applied Positive Psychology program at the University of Pennsylvania, which is one of the places where in the world a lot of people go to be able to learn about how to apply the lessons of positive psychology in all sorts of different domains. And
is it right?
Sorry, say that again.
How life transforming is it? Isn't it?
It was such an incredible program. It was an incredible program for so many reasons. One, because it's a phenomenal program. Like, the pedagogy of the program is extraordinary, but it's also phenomenal in what positive psychology is. And I think that maybe it's worth just kind of pausing in this podcast to even explain, like, what is positive psychology. In the world of the history of psychology really was meant to study the whole spectrum of human experience. How do people think, feel, and do? Those who are sick, those who are normal, those who are gifted. And most of psychology over especially the history of the 20th century wound up focusing on the deficit, what's wrong with people, and how do we fix them. And there was very, very little, although certainly not none, but very little psychology that focused on what's right with people and how do we get more of that. And that's really what positive psychology is in the world to try to do. It's supposed to look at the whole entire curve of human experience and say, what's happening above the zero line? How do we have more of the amazing things like positive emotions or engagement or relationships or meaning or accomplishment in our lives? How do people who encounter challenge bounce back, but not only bounce back better? Those are all questions that positive psychology tends to answer. So positive psychology in many ways is the study of well-being. It's the study of resilience. It's the study of things that right now, especially, are more important than ever.
Yeah, it's gaining more and more attention because I guess people are aware of the ill-being perspective is not making us thriving. So it's not about just fixing the problem or solving the problem, but about creating better environments, creating better families, better schools, better communities, better workplaces, so that people can be fully there to show their potential.
And I think that's exactly the thing that I'm particularly interested in, that last thing that you said around a workplace. How do you create a workplace that really allows someone to be their best selves? And I use the term eudaimonia, which is an ancient Greek term that the Aristotle most famously used to describe what well-being or happiness might look like. There's really no good word in English. I'm actually curious whether there's a word in Turkish that like gets closer to what Aristotle meant. I can say that let me say with Aristotle. Like the thing that I love about what Aristotle like talked about when he talked about eudaimonia was he said that a life well lived was a life where if you got to the end of it and you looked backwards, you would feel that that you would have had high well-being if every day you made the deliberate and conscious choice to pursue virtuous action, and that you deliberately chose to do it, that you brought the full capacity of your strengths and your talents and your abilities to that challenge. And that's always a hard thing. It always requires making huge amounts of choices and balancing decisions and recognizing you can always go too far or too little in any direction. And so it really requires reason and deliberate choice, and not just thinking about these things, but actually doing. And that's what well-being is. Well-being is this thing that's filled with purpose, that's filled with meaning, that's filled with action.
Reflection.
Completely. And yeah, in English, there's certainly there's no word that remotely comes close.
But what comes to my mind when you say whether we have a closer word to that in Turkish, maybe the geographically, the ancient Greek and the Anatolian geography, maybe the roots of that kind of thinking, the philosophical thinking, arise from that geography. So this is why maybe we have similar words, but still, in many languages, not only in Turkish, not only in English, in many languages, eudaimonia or well-being is easily mixed with pure happiness, which is
pleasure. Right.
totally hedonism. But eudaimonia, eudaimonic wellness, eudaimonic outcomes are not that equal to just having that all the pleasant, all the pleasure-giving things, right? Because there is labor, there's some labor in it, as in workplace.
It's hard. It's hard work.
Yeah.
It's hard work, and I think there's no silver bullet. There's no 3 simple steps to living a eudaimonic life or being eudaimonic in the workplace. And so it's another. I mean, the company that I run is called Eudaimonic by Design, and it's really what our purpose is. We believe that organizations, if people truly did pursue their work with the kind of ethics and excellence and engagement that eudaimonia is all about, if people really chose to bring all of that to work, that's the recipe for high performance in an organization. It would be impossible to think of what more you could want of an employee than their most eudaimonic selves. And most organizations, as you and I both know very well, are almost designed to do the opposite, whether it's how a manager works, whether it's how human resources operates, whether it's how decisions get made, how funding choices happen. All of those things often work against the ways that would allow someone to actually be their most eudaimonic selves. And so if you think eudaimonia is important and you want more of that in your organization, you really have to think differently about leadership, about culture, about governance, about systems. And those are the things that we like to think about in Eudaimonic by Design.
And this is in Eudaimonic by Design, this is what we help to other organizations to design accordingly. It really requires effort, deliberate action, and thoughtful, purposeful designing process. And I regret that some workplaces, some managers, some administrators can, no regret, say, well, this is workplace. This is not a place to have fun, or this is not a place to be happy, just be happy out there and in your real life. This is none of our business. Actually, this is kind of a working on ourselves business, so that we have that resources, being resourceful to work on the tasks at every workplace, whatever they are working at, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
So tell us about the resources that in Eudaimonic by Design we created to help the companies actually for that way, in that
Yeah. Well,
journey.
if it's interesting, if you had asked us, before the pandemic in January, what did Eudaimonic by Design do? I would have probably said that the biggest thing that we did was help organizations that really want to do good in the world walk their own talk. That's
Mhm.
probably the most succinct way that I could bring it down. Very few of the people that we were talking to wanted to necessarily talk about well-being, wanted to talk about things like resilience. Those were all important things. But if they were talking about it, they were talking about it from a place of mental illness, or they were talking about it from a place of depression and anxiety or stress or burnout. Very few people were actually talking about well-being for the sake of well-being. How do we truly help people thrive? And then when the pandemic hit, and all of us were thrown into a massive amount of crisis, suddenly questions of well-being really became front and center. In many ways, one of the most extraordinary things that we saw in the pandemic was that most companies in the world decided to deprioritize economics and money and prioritize human lives.
Yeah.
And they were doing that to save lives, not to just, it wasn't just about, making sick people better. It was actually about keeping healthy people healthy. And then suddenly, with people working remotely, with people having to work in new ways, they had to think about all these things, like how do we cultivate relationships in a different way, in a virtual way? How do we think about helping people find meaning in the work that they're doing right now, especially because so much of us had to pivot, no matter what we were doing, to try to figure out how we could help someone else in the world. Asking questions around how do you stay engaged at work right now? And how do you just stay resilient? How do you stay optimistic? How do you have hope in the context of the pandemic? All of these were the kinds of questions that we started hearing companies ask, which was exactly what positive psychology strives to study. And we thought, as a community of practitioners in positive psychology, that the biggest thing that we could do quickly was just create resources that would allow people to have access to some of that knowledge in really practical and tactical ways, not dense academic or big long HR tomes, but really short 1 or 2 page guides that are very, very practical, that help people, especially managers of people, understand what it means to maintain optimism, to have hope, to be resilient, to create high quality relationships and connections with one another. And those were some of the things that we did.
How many different tools we created during that program?
We've created over 20 different tools that have been in the world, and they've been accessed. They're all at Eudaimonic by Design. And if you don't want to spell that, and I don't blame you if you don't, it's eubd.ca, eubd.ca. All of them are free on our website, and they've been accessed, I don't know, thousands of times all across the world, in countries all across the world. They're being translated into Spanish. There's all sorts of different communities that are using them. It's been really satisfying to be able to see how many people have been able to find value in those tools.
And I guess in that sense, this pandemic showed us how resourceful we are. So maybe before that, we were not thinking about creating that kind of a tool that can go viral globally, right?
Completely.
Or another company from another continent or another country would not be thinking about approaching touch-free tools, for example.
Yeah.
Working remotely is something new for many companies. Some companies are switching to closing down their physical offices and decide to continue working remotely. And these were not not acceptable in some ways, or not the norm at least, or not the first prototypical way of solving problems or approaching resources, but no, it is. And we realize that we are like one crisis ahead of realizing the human aspect of work life. so, so we realize how important, I mean, many companies, many HR professionals, many leaders really realize, oh my God, this is not about the work we are doing. This is about the work we are putting on ourselves, like the design that companies are indeed the people working there. So
I think I think that's really well said.
in that sense, I guess the human aspect as the most ignored part of human resources processes, now
Yeah.
it's kind of transforming in that sense.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that there's, it's most of the companies that I'm talking to these days are talking about pivoting, right? I feel like all of us have had to do a lot of pivoting, and I think that you're absolutely right. I think that people are focusing on the human side of human resources, or at least they have. And I think about the pandemic, um, uh, certainly not like a sprint, but probably a little bit more like a triathlon or an Ironman competition, right? The maybe the first part of that competition, which might have been the long distance swimming, is over, but now we have to, climb out of the water and get onto a bike and figure out how to ride a bike, and then we'll have to like get off that bike and figure out how to run a marathon after that. This pandemic isn't a short-term thing. That these are the realities of the world that we're living in are going to continue to be changing over the next 18 or 24 months for many industries before there's any kind of actual return to true normal that happens. And so I think that companies really are starting to think really differently about all of these questions. And I think a lot about the work that you do around human needs, and our most fundamental human needs around things like competency and relatedness and autonomy, and how do those needs ultimately get manifested in situations where people are going to continue to be working virtual for much longer than they intended, or even if they do go back into an office, that experience is going to be so radically different than the way that they might have gone into an office before. Or if they have people who are working if they have a hybrid teams where part of the team is going to keep working remotely and part of the team is going to be in an office environment that feels very different. All of those things are going to require completely rethinking our fundamental human needs and thinking about how do we create organizations, how do we design intentionally organizations that allow people to be at their best in all of these different circumstances.
My insight about this topic, because I keep hearing whether it is nice to go back to the physical office or whether people need to keep working remotely. And the answer is totally depending on the autonomous decisions of the employees there, in what sense they will feel competent, in what sense they will be able to connect and relate themselves more, and in what sense their autonomous functioning will be supported. And it can change to person, company to company, department to department. And yeah,
one of the really cool things that I'll say, that especially in the really big companies that I've noticed, but it's really not limited to the big companies, is that there's actually much more desire to listen to employees now than I think I've ever seen in my professional career. And I think it's about recognizing that there's so much that that autonomy, that autonomous kind of desire, the recognition that people are going to be able to want to choose their own adventure is actually a really, really, really critical thing right now, whether that's from a health and safety perspective or whether that's from a productivity and engagement perspective, and a recognition that all of us are different. I mean, there's people who love working from home and want to be able to do it forever. There's people who hate working from home and who can't wait to get back into the office. And both of those people might be on the exact same team. And so recognizing that there's going to be such a spectrum of different perspectives and what it means to give someone autonomy or freedom to be able to make a choice for themselves is probably one of the most important things that you can do for an employee right now.
And this design is like a blend of different choices. This optimal designs will be like the blend of choices, and it's an issue of integration of the job demands and the needs of the
needs
people,
of the human.
of the
Absolutely.
like instead of
Absolutely.
saying human resources, maybe we can refer them as human assets that needs.
That's right.
that
I mean, the other thing, and like on that asset level, the other thing that I'm deeply aware of, and this goes to another one of those fundamental human needs, which is competency or mastery. The reality that we've grown so much over the last 3 months since March, since so many of us, at least in North American context, started to deal with the realities of the pandemic. We've been able to do things in organizations that would never have been thought like remotely possible, or that would have had 5 or 10-year runways. Like the things that have been able to have been accomplished over the last 3 months are astronomical, and all of us, at an individual level, in a team level, from an organization level, have really learned and grown so much in so many different ways. And as we know, learning and growing is not always fun. It's kind of like that eudaimonic versus hedonic thing. It's not, it doesn't necessarily mean that we've enjoyed it, but we've been able to do so much, and we've been able to learn and grow. And thinking about the assets there, that collective learning, and how we make sure that no matter where we go moving forward, we learn from and carry those lessons with us into the future, is, I think, another massive opportunity for organizations as they face the future.
For my observation, one of the biggest misconceptions of positive psychology is as if it's all about everything like good and positive, but ignoring the part of the painful growth and learning curve. So I'm glad you pointed out that. So my wish for organizations is to have this experience as a precious scar to grow through what they go through. And this kind of like, it's a kind of a like organizational organizing the self, both self and organizing the organization. So from the individual level to the community level to the organizational level, it requires collective learning and collective creativity to find out figure out that positive deviance that works for everyone, that fits for everyone's need, and growing through what they go through will be a precious scar after that. So in the next levels of the marathon that you mentioned, biking, hiking, swimming.
I love the metaphor of the scar, because I think it's actually really, it speaks to me a lot. It makes me think of a lot of work that's been done within positive psychology on questions of trauma, right? Like we look at trauma, and this is a perfect example of like the difference between positive psychology and normal psychology, right? Like we think of trauma and we normally immediately think of post-traumatic stress disorder, what that people go through traumatic events, and that will necessarily lead to, to PTSD, and right, absolutely. And there's some people who go through trauma who get scars, who grow, and who are resilient, and who are able to withstand extraordinary things. It's all of that starts with Viktor Frankl and Man's Search for Meaning, and the fact that the person who actually talks the most, in some ways, the earliest grandfather, in some ways, of positive psychology, in at least the 20th century, is somebody who is a survivor of the concentration camps, and who found a sense of meaning from that experience, and literally wrote the book on what it means to search for meaning. That what separates, in many ways, our capacity to look at traumatic events as either things that are going to help us or harm us is our capacity to see meaning in it. And so it just also makes me think so much about what's the work that organizations need to do right now to make meaning of what has been happening and the journeys they've been going through and the scars that they have received throughout this process.
And this will be, as it is a collective learning, this will be a collective healing process after all. And this requires that psychosocial connectedness, the social support, the emotional support, and the psychological safety that organizations and especially leaders need to implement in their work culture, in their corporate culture, so that people can heal together and show their scars to each other. Here, look what happened to me and what happened to us, and how we can heal together. Like,
I'm actually really curious. I'm curious to ask you, because I know that one of the extraordinary things about you is your psychodrama background, and the ways in which you literally do work with groups of people to collectively heal. And I'm curious as you think about this pandemic and as you think about what organizations or leaders can do right now to bring some of those lessons from psychodrama into the work that they're doing in their teams right now to process, to heal. What recommendations would you offer?
What I personally do nowadays is about offering individual coachings and mentorships to leaders, so that it starts with the self, again, with the leader, so that the leader can bring those psychological resource to the organization. And group therapy, in a way, group psychotherapy is pretty much applicable to organizational trainings as well. And it is, again, also a developing and collective growth space for teams. And they don't like the word teams, actually, because teams have conflict, teams have like rivalry, teams have some negative connotations as well. But group learning, group training resonates better for them, because it brings another meaning for their psychological needs in that sense. So they can yield their defenses, they can be vulnerable, they can have that courage to show what worked so far, what didn't work in that process, what the voice behavior actually can be easily implemented with the organizational trainings based on positive psychology and group psychotherapy, and especially in the psychodrama sense, playfulness, because play is when we are mostly creative, mostly connected, and mostly able to develop new competencies by safe trials and errors and learning from failures. So playfulness is kind of the key for me, in my experience, for easily implementing such perspective and such culture in that sense. And thanks for asking that. I love that question.
I have a harder question if you want one. Well, it makes me think, I mean, we're having this conversation, the week following all sorts of unrest around social justice issues, around Black Lives Matter, around police brutality protests, all over the world around the killing of George Floyd. And I mean, you just spoke about vulnerability and collective learning and healing, which is, I think, also something, those difficult conversations in organizations right now are also need to happen. I know that managers in all sorts of different situations are having to find the courage and vulnerability to have conversations that they're potentially really deeply uncomfortable about having. And I'm guessing that play isn't necessarily the answer, but I don't know. I wonder what advice you have for managers who are facing a really tough conversation. How does that turn into a courageous conversation?
So I cannot say play per se, but playfulness is really a tool for reflecting what's going on, because this is where we can put our emotions, thoughts into action. and change accordingly and realize the blind spots that either individually one has or the corporate culture has in terms of diversity, inclusion, in many senses. And in terms of the Black Lives Matter and talking about the lack of consciousness, the lack of taking deliberate action is a if we can talk from the role perspective, this anger, this frustration comes from like 4 or 5 years old timeline of our lives. We can be disappointed, we can be defiant, we can be angry, upset, and yelling and shouting, and this is what we do when we are frustrated. And how we can suit it also be traced back to our 4 or 5 years old times. And this is through play is very easy to figure out what's missing in that part. So working with kids really taught me a lot in terms of that, because when 4 or 5 years are playing with each other, any individual differences are just a topic of curiosity. They are curious of each other. They want to learn from each other. They can ask for everything, anything to each other. And whatever answer, whatever response they get is full of acceptance. Whatever is coming is totally acceptable and totally unique to make that connection. So even like making lists or drawing, painting, throwing the balls, making nets, webs of like ropes or colorful, let's say the silk, what is it called? Ribbon. Okay. Colorful ribbons to denote some of the emotional loads we are having in terms of that, and inviting playfully to say it's okay not to be okay in that sense. It's okay to yell out. It's okay to cry out. It's okay to protest. It's okay to call for justice. And through different kinds of any type of kindergarten activities, any type of play. You don't need to be a psychodramatist to do that, but regressing back to the inner child, that vulnerable child, and that courageous and accepting child, to make that connection is what we already were when we were child. So maybe turning back to that skills, that's a skill. Being a child is a skill, definitely a skill.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Well, Andrew, such a conversation with you as always. Maybe it's nice to remind one more time about that our free resources about resilience tools, how to type of short checklists and mini readings that many leaders and individuals can benefit in that throughout this process. Not just nowadays, but they were already necessary, but how important those resources were maybe neglected. But now it's becoming the essential, not only important, but the essential thing, right? So
yeah, we like to say that they're tools that will help you survive this period of time, but thrive in the best of times.
Perfect. Tell us where people can reach those resources.
Yeah, you can get them at www.eubd.ca. That's eubd.ca, or eudaimonicbydesign.com if you really want to try to like practice your Greek.
Why not? That's also a learning curve. Learning Greek. My dear Andrew Soren, thanks for being here and thanks for being my first guest.
Thank you for having me. It's been such a pleasure. I love talking with you, and I'm so excited for this to be the first of many.
Yeah. Well, I hope we can make many more episodes about many more topics as well together. And it's always a great joy to collaborate with you. Thanks for being here.